Welcome to this RETN Newsroom election interview. Our guest today is Representative Bernard Sanders, Incumbent Independent Candidate for Congress. Welcome.
Nice to be with you.
Great, we're glad to have you here. There is considerable debate in our country about the purpose and scope of government. It seems like the trend in American politics tends to be to smaller, less intrusive government, starting with President Reagan and continuing through Bush and even Clinton. If reelected, what would your position be?
Well, my view on the role of government is the following. I think that everything being equal, when it comes to personal matters of individuals, I think people have the right to live their lives as best they can without interference from the government. What people want to do with their sexual lives or other aspects of their lives is their own business. On the other hand, what I also believe is that in a democratic, civilized society, we have an obligation, and in fact we have the resources in this country to make sure that every man, woman, and child has a decent standard of living. I know there are a lot of people who disagree with me on that, but I think that we have a moral obligation to make sure that everybody in our country lives decently. And I get very upset, for example, that we have 20% of our children who are living in poverty, while we have had in recent years a proliferation of millionaires and billionaires. I think, in fact, it is our social obligation and the role of the government to make sure that every man, woman, and child in this country has health care, that every young person has educational opportunity through college, regardless of the income of their families. So I believe that in terms of economic issues, the government, in fact, should play a very, very aggressive role, and especially protecting the weakest and most vulnerable among us.
So you feel that the state government should be responsible for the citizens as opposed to individual responsibility?
Well, I'm in Congress, so primarily concerned with what happens. But if your question is, do I think that we should have elderly people in this country and in our own state of Vermont who get sick or die because they can't afford prescription drugs, I don't think that that is acceptable. And I think the government should act in that area. If you would ask me, do I think it's acceptable that there are people who are listening to this program or seeing this program who can't afford to go to the doctor? That is unacceptable. Every American should have health care as a right of citizenship. You're a young person. You're going to high school right now. There are young people in the state of Vermont now who are in high school who are not going to be able to go to the college of their choice, who may not even be able to go to college because they lack adequate funding, income from their families. There are kids who will graduate college deeply in debt. Do I think the government has a role to make sure that every young person in this country, every person in this country has the right to get a college education regardless of the income of their family? Absolutely. So I believe that the government should play a very aggressive role in making sure that all of our people have the opportunity not only to fulfill their own potential, but to be better citizens. Just think about the waste to our country when we have young people who are not getting the quality education that they need. So I do believe the government should play an aggressive role in all of those areas.
You've been extremely active in advocating lower pricing on pharmaceutical drugs.
Yes.
Could you explain to us where the nation is in this process
Sure.
and what you've been doing to advocate this?
Do you have several hours for this? Okay. Now this is an issue I've been working very hard on. In fact, I've probably been the leader in Congress on the issue. And this touches on the question that you just asked me a moment ago. In the state of Vermont and throughout this country, you have millions of senior citizens and others who cannot afford the high prices of prescription drugs. Today in the United States, our people are paying significantly higher prices than our folks in Canada, Mexico, Europe, any place else in the world. As you may or may not know, I took a trip to Canada last year with a number of Vermonters, and what we found is that certain drugs were selling in Canada, the exact same product was selling for 1/10 the price that they were selling in the United States. Tamoxifen, which is a widely prescribed drug for breast cancer, was selling 10% of the cost there as opposed to the United States. What I have been doing now is I introduced legislation which, as we speak, is going to be brought before a conference committee, variations of my legislation, which would lower the cost of prescription drugs in this country by 30 to 50%, very simply by saying that pharmacists and prescription drug distributors should be able to purchase FDA safety-approved prescription drugs any place in the world that they can get that product. So in other words, our pharmacists in the state of Vermont should be able to purchase their drugs in Canada so long as they're FDA safety approved. The result will be a very substantial reduction in prices in the state of Vermont. Number two, even with that, we have to make sure that prescription drugs are a benefit under Medicare. Many elderly people, even with lower drug prices, are going to need help with Medicare. So those are some of the areas that we have been working. But what you should understand is we have been opposed by the pharmaceutical industry, which is the most profitable industry in America, which last year made $27 billion in profits, which has contributed $9 million to both political parties, which has 300 paid lobbyists in Washington, D.C., which is currently running radio, television, and newspaper ads against the legislation that I've offered. They are very powerful special interests whose primary concern is to make sure their profits remain high, and in my view, they could care less whether seniors in the state of Vermont suffer or die because they can't afford their prescription drugs. But getting back to the point that I made earlier, there are some people who say, well, you know, government should not be involved in this area. People get sick and they die because they can't afford prescription drugs. Well, it's a tough life. I don't agree with that. I think our government should play an active role in protecting the sick in this country, all healthcare consumers, and make sure that we get prescription drugs at a price that people can afford.
I have a question about this. Is it an all-inclusive plan, or is it for just senior citizens?
The lowering of prices is for everybody. And basically what it says is if you wanted to buy a computer, okay, you go to a store. Well, that computer is likely, it could be manufactured any place in the world. And the people and you go in and you buy that. That is true for almost every product that we purchase, for better or for worse in the global economy. It is not true for prescription drugs. The only people who can sell prescription drugs in this country to your pharmacist is the pharmaceutical industry. And what they do is have a monopoly, and as a result, they're charging very, very high prices. So this legislation, which would allow prescription drug distributors and pharmacists to purchase their products in Canada, Europe, anywhere they can get a good price, would affect every consumer, not just senior citizens. But obviously, the prescription drug benefit under Medicare would benefit senior citizens exclusively.
So you've clearly stated that you think the federal government should really play an active role in regulating business and...
Well, not a question of regulating business. In this case, let's turn it around, okay?
Sure.
We are the only country in the world where the pharmaceutical industry can sell their products at any price that they want. And to add insult to injury, many of the anti-cancer drugs, many of the drugs dealing with AIDS and other products were developed with taxpayer dollars. So we develop the drug, we give it over to the drug companies, they charge us any price they want. So let me turn your question around. Do I think that drug companies should be able to sell their products at any price they want, even if it means that people are going to get sick and die? The answer is no. The government should play a very active role. Furthermore, in my view, the government should make sure that every man, woman, and child in this country has health care as a right of citizenship.
Excellent. Could you explain your position on progressive tax reform?
Good. Very good question. Nobody likes to pay taxes, that's for sure. And we always have a heated debate. We have it in school districts. How much should a school district be spending? I was mayor of the city of Burlington for 8 years, always had a heated debate. How much should we be spending on public works, on the police department, on the fire department? And those are the kinds of debates that every community in the state should have. What is the proper amount of money? Some people are saying, well, let's spend more money on our schools. Some people say, well, no, let's not. That's a good debate to have. But after you have that debate and you reach a conclusion as to how much money should be spent at the local level, at the state level, which the legislature does, at the federal level, which I help do, then the next question is, well, how do you fund those programs? Whether it is schools in Winooski or Burlington, or whether it is state government in Montpelier, whether it is the federal government. We have a $1.8 trillion national budget. What is the fairest way to raise that money? Okay? So this is not a debate about how big or small the Defense Department should be. After you reach a conclusion, how do you adequately fund that budget? To my mind, what progressive taxation means, and I believe in this very, very strongly, is that in a nation which currently has the most unfair distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. In other words, the wealthiest people have seen huge increases in their income. Middle-class people are often working longer hours for lower wages. A lot of people are poor. That I think what we should do is develop a progressive tax system which asks upper-income people to pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes than the middle class or working families. That is my view. Now, the Republican Party, and many Democrats, to tell you the truth, do not necessarily agree with me. To give you an example of an approach which moves in the opposite direction. Just last week, I voted to support the president's veto, to sustain the president's veto on the repeal of the estate tax. Okay? The Republican leadership in Congress said, well, let us repeal the estate tax. And when you study the issue, you know what you find? Do you know what percentage of the American people pay the estate tax?
I'm not sure right now.
The richest 2%. And under the Republican proposal, we would have lost $750 billion in revenue over a 20-year period. That's a lot of money, okay? And all of the benefits would have gone to the richest 2%. Half of those benefits would have gone to the richest 1/10 of 1%. In the state of Vermont, it would amount to about 10 families getting half of the benefits. Meanwhile, there are people in the state who cannot afford childcare, can't afford to send their kids to college, can't afford health care. We have all kinds of problems, and our Republican friends were proposing to give huge tax breaks to the richest people in this country. That, to my mind, is what we call regressive taxation. The Social Security tax is a regressive tax. If I make $1 million a year and you make $15,000 a year, we both pay the same percentage of our incomes in taxes. The gas tax is a regressive tax. I have a big fancy car, I have a whole lot of money. You're driving your old clinker to work at $7 an hour. We both pay the same gas tax. So I would like to move our tax system in a more progressive way, especially at a time when the wealthier have never been wealthier.
Excellent. You have not endorsed Anthony Pollitt, who also holds many of the same progressive values that you do. Could you explain this?
No, only in the sense that I don't often get involved in gubernatorial races. And for a long variety of reasons, a wide variety of reasons, I've chosen not to be a member of the Progressive Party. I'm an independent now and working hard to try to represent Vermont in the Congress.
Excellent. Now, civil unions is a very big issue in Vermont, and I know that it is a state issue, but given that it's been so divisive and unprecedented, do you believe that the process of its ratification was adequate?
I do. I understand that this is an incredibly divisive issue, and it saddens me very much. I would ask people, and again, I didn't vote on this issue, I'm in Washington. The Vermont State Legislature was asked to deal with a ruling from the Vermont Supreme Court that the current system is unconstitutional, and they had to act. And I think under very difficult circumstances and with a whole lot of emotion and a lot of honest people on both sides, what they ended up doing, in my view, was the right thing to do. I would hope, as we discuss the issue of civil unions, that we understand that it is one issue out of many issues that are out there. And I know that there are people on both sides of the issue who feel very, very strongly about it. And to be honest with you, I get a little bit upset about some of the heat that has been generated. People can disagree without being, as they say, disagreeable. So I hope it's an issue that we can discuss in a rational way. But if your question is, do I support what the legislature did, I do.
I'm originally from Oregon, where controversial issues like this are usually settled by ballot measures, such as physician-assisted suicide. Do you think that it could have been better settled by like a referendum and getting the people involved, or?
The answer is a firm yes and no. Let me tell you the advantages and disadvantages. In fact, in states like California and Oregon right now, they're running into a whole lot of problems with referenda, because there are zillions of them on the ballot. There is a widespread belief that almost nobody knows what any of these ballots are about, ballot issues are about. And furthermore, what is happening is that people are sometimes paying, people who have a lot of money are paying people to go out, get signatures, get it on the ballot, and then spending a whole lot of money advertising to get it passed. So there are pluses and minuses of the referendum system. And I think in some instances and sometimes it may be a good thing. On the other hand, when you have a legislative body, you have the opportunity to, in fact, debate the issue. And if you elect your neighbors into a legislature in a small state like Vermont, it is a fairly good process. And if people don't like the way their members voted, their representatives voted, they could deal with that at election time.
Well, one of the major issues that's been brought up by civil unions is the question of the job of the representative. Do you feel that it is like their responsibility to vote their own conscience or statistically reflect the population?
Well, that's a good question. And I think ultimately, of course, it's going to have to be, you're not a good elected official if you don't reflect the views of your constituents. You don't get elected if you don't do that, nor should you, right? You don't go down there and say, well, I don't really care what my people feel. I'm going to vote for this thing. I mean, that would be silly, and you would last one term. On the other hand, we don't have a government which is run by computers. And ultimately, people entrust their representative, whether it's in Congress or in Montpelier, to be listening to a whole lot of debates and learning a whole lot about things that the average person might not, in terms of a whole lot of issues. So I think it's a combination. I think any good elected representative, everything being equal, is in fact going to vote what his or her constituents want. On the other hand, there are some issues out there that a member of Congress or a member of the legislature might have studied or learned about in a way that the person back home doesn't know. And that elected official is going to have to say, well, I know that you disagree with me, but here is my reasoning. It's A, B, and C, and that's why I voted that way. And I think that most citizens understand and are prepared to give their elected representatives a certain amount of leeway. On the other hand, obviously, if a elected official keeps voting in a way that the people or individual citizens feel does not represent them, that person is going to get voted out of office.
Excellent. One of the major issues that the youth is very concerned with is the youth involvement in politics. And, America has the lowest percentage of voting participation of any Western democracy. And if adults aren't motivated, how can the youth be?
Okay, excellent question. That is a very important question. It's an issue that I talk about a whole lot. As you indicated, we have the lowest voter turnout of any major country on earth. And what is even more frightening is that the voter turnout for young people is far lower than it is for the general population. I think there are statistics that suggest that in the last election, fewer than perhaps 20% of the young people under 25 actually voted. So that is a very dangerous trend. Now, why is that? It has a lot to do, I think, with the failure of the two-party system, and one of the reasons that I'm an independent, with explaining to the people in general and young people in particular why they should be involved in the democratic process. I think a lot of young people and a lot of citizens in general say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect me. And that is terribly, terribly wrong. The decisions that take place in Washington, the decisions that take place in Montpelier directly affect young people and all citizens. For example, many of the young people your age are intending to go to college. The cost of college is very, very high. As a nation, we spend proportionately significantly less money on education and higher education than do other countries, other major countries. For example, if you were in Europe, if you were in Germany, you would find the cost of college education is free or very, very inexpensive. Young people should ask themselves why it is that they have to go deeply in debt, or their families have to go deeply in debt, when we are spending $22 billion more this year on the military rather than putting that money into education. That is an issue that affects young people. Many young people are concerned about the quality of our environment and all of the ramifications of that. Young people should be asking, for example, why we are giving huge amounts of tax breaks to polluters rather than investing that money in energy conservation and environmental programs that will save our planet. So there, healthcare and so forth and so on. There are decent jobs. Many of the young people are graduating high school who are going out into the workforce are working for substantially lower wages than was the case 20 years ago. Instead of working in manufacturing, they're working in McDonald's for minimum wage. So young people obviously want to make sure that the economy is strong for the middle class. So I think that the two major parties have not done a good job in explaining the political process. They're too busy raising money from wealthy people and putting 30-second ads on television. Frankly, I think the media has done a very, very poor job in explaining not only to the American citizenry, but to young people especially, how the system works. Right. Now you go to Rice High School, right?
Right, I do. Mm-hmm.
So if I went to Rice High School and I asked kids, how many points do you get when you score a touchdown, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody knows it's 6 points, right? Mm-hmm. How many points do you get when you make a basket in a basketball game? It's 2 points. Then you say to kids, okay, how do you get your concerns addressed in a democratic society? Well, I don't know. I haven't a clue. Okay, so how come we know so much about basketball, baseball, football, all the sports, all the movie actors, and yet you don't know, and young people don't know, and many Americans don't know how you can input? You got a problem. Mm-hmm. How does your state legislature or the United States Congress address that issue? How can you fight for your point of view? A lot of young people don't know it. The media does not do a very good job in that, and I think that the media, given the fact that it is largely owned by large multinational corporations who represent the wealthy, are not necessarily interested, to be frank with you, in getting people involved in the political process.
So do you have any original ideas on how to handle this problem?
Well, it's an issue that we work on, yeah. Number one, I think we should do a lot better job in educating young people in our schools. In fact, I was just last month talking to the Commissioner of Education, Mr. Wolk, about that issue, and seeing if we can get more what we used to call civics, but explain to the young people how government functions in a democratic society, why they should be voting. Second of all, I think we should have law in the state of Vermont that any young person who graduates high school is automatically registered to vote. Thirdly, I think we should be looking at things like same-day registration, which a number of states in this country have, so that on election day, even if you're not registered, you can walk into a polling booth, take out your voter ID, not your voter ID, but your ID card, and vote. And obviously, if there's any fraud, there will be a very serious penalty against that person. I think we might want to experiment with using the internet to get young people involved in the voting process. So there are a lot of things that we can do, but ultimately, I think, not only for young people, we have got to educate the American public in general what democracy is about. Democracy is an extraordinarily radical idea. The idea that ordinary people, rather than kings or wealthy people, can be running society is a fairly radical idea, and I fear very much that we are losing our democratic traditions. So there are very few issues that concern me more than about how we can get people involved in the political process, and especially young people.
Many people who don't vote say that they find the two major parties essentially the same. As an independent, do you feel that this is true?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm an independent. But then the next question is that they have to ask, well, what is the similarities?
Right.
And then you got to think a little bit about it. The major problem with American politics today, and why so many people, including young people, are turned off, is both parties are heavily dominated by big money interest. I gave you an example a moment ago, the pharmaceutical industry. $6 million to the Republican Party, $3 million to the Democratic Party. Major corporation after major corporation contributes to both political parties. Both political parties have fundraising dinners for $25,000 a plate, okay?
Right.
So you have both parties heavily dominated by big money. That is not to say that there are not very decent people, hardworking, honest people in both the Democratic and Republican parties. But by and large, the reason that Congress recently passed legislation, thank God it was vetoed by the president, would have given huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, and at the same time we don't have enough money to take care of our veterans. We don't have enough money to put into education. We don't have enough money to provide health care to all people, enough money to protect the environment. It's a question of priorities. The wealthy are primarily interested in becoming even richer. They want to pay lower taxes. They want to make sure that our environmental regulations are weakened so their corporations can make more money through polluting the environment. They are not interested in seeing the minimum wage go up because they don't want to pay workers more money. They are anti-union by and large because they don't want workers to be able to collectively bargain. Now that's an issue that is not talked about too much on the media. So the $64 question is, in American society today and in our two-party system, what kind of power does big money have as opposed to the needs of ordinary citizens?
Excellent. One other thing before we conclude, safety in schools has unfortunately become a very prominent issue of our time. I was just wondering what's being done in Congress to, enforce things and try to make the school environments much safer.
I get around the state of Vermont a lot, and I go to many schools, and many young people are very concerned about that, and especially when we had some of those crises that we had in the last couple of years where there were shootings in Columbine and elsewhere. I think for a start, what we want to do is to enable schools to have the funding so that they can have counselors or psychologists work with kids who have the potential to be violent. I think that there are some kids in schools in the state of Vermont throughout this country who are isolated, who come from dysfunctional or difficult families. They don't have a way to communicate their anxieties and their fears to adults or to other young people. And I think those are the kinds of kids in that isolation that can develop strange thoughts and paranoia and the need to do violence. So I would hope that we would have the resources in our schools to reach out to those young people and talk to them and bring them back into society and allow them to express their pain.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us, Representative Sanders, and thank you for watching this newsroom election interview.